So today we are going to be ranking all of these status effects in Elden Ring from worst to best and based on how useful they are. So basically the things we're going to take into consideration is how many enemies are actually susceptible to the status effect, how powerful the effect actually is, how reliable it is to proc, and also take into account the sources of these statuses as well. Now obviously ranking the status effects doesn't really mean much because you're not really forced into one in particular, but I'm still going to talk about them because I'm a yapper. I like to yap. That's what I do. Now starting off right at the bottom, we have Death Blight. Now this status effect instantly kills things. As soon as the meter fills to the max, they just instantly die, which obviously is like an amazing effect to have. It's probably the best effect to have. But for everything else that actually makes a status effect good, this thing just does it the worst. Starting off with the fact that there are like no enemies outside of NPCs that you actually can use this on in PvE. Like not a single enemy can be procced with a Death Blight. And there isn't even like a lesser version of Death Blight to where like they just get debuffed or something like that. No, nothing at all. Zero effect. So basically the entire use is for PvP, which it even sucks there as well because the sources just do not proc Death Blight quickly, which is honestly a good thing because trying to balance a status effect that instantly kills somebody is just impossible. Like how are you going to balance something like that? This status effect shouldn't have like existed to begin with. It should have had a different type of effect and not really just instantly kill somebody. But the funny thing is there's literally more sources in the game that actually mitigate and cure Death Blight then there are things that actually do Death Blight. The only ones being the Eclipse Shuttle, Fear's Mist, and the Death Lightning Incantation. Of which those things are like the most terrible things in the entire game. You probably have like the worst Curve Sword mixed in with like the worst Sorcery with the worst Incantation. Like these things are dog shit. The only one of these that actually can reliably proc the Death Blight would be Fear's Mist, but any enemy that stands inside the mist long enough to get procced with Death Blight honestly deserves to get procced with Death Blight because it takes forever to still proc it. So hopefully in the DLC they feel the need to like rework the status effects to make it just do something different and just add some more sources of Death Blight as well and probably make it work in PvE, please. Number 7, we have Sleep. Now there are two different types of Sleep, depending on which enemy they actually do go up against. One where the enemy just completely just like knocks themselves out, they fall asleep for about like 40 seconds, and there's another one where enemies just do get staggered. But really the only use for this status effect in PvE is against the Godskin enemies because they're the only boss that actually can fully fall asleep. Everything else just gets staggered, which the stagger itself is really nice, but I'd rather just proc almost any other status effect in the game. Because the funny thing is like the action of stance breaking an enemy literally gets them staggered longer than the sleep staggering effect. Like how is a status effect just straight up worse than staggering an enemy? It's easy to do, they get staggered for longer, and they're susceptible to a riposte attack, which I don't know why when enemies get staggered by sleep, they're not really susceptible to a riposte attack. That really should work that way. Like we don't do any types of bonus damage or anything like that. It's like a half a second stagger, which outside of certain types of like challenge runs, it's going to be like very useless. But it definitely is a lot more reliable in PvP because that little staggering effect can just make or break whether you win or lose a game. And in that time, you can like have a fully charged heavy attack or a fully charged weapon skill, and you can probably end up like just one-shotting enemies that way. But unfortunately, once again, the sources of sleep are just going to be very minimal. There's only two weapons that do proc sleep. One is a torch, and the other one is just a straight sword that gets shitty scalings and terrible damage. Now, both of them actually do proc sleep pretty quickly, which is nice. So I probably just use them as like a secondary option just to proc sleep and then switch back to another weapon, potentially. But the things that actually do it the best would be things like sleep pots, arrows, and crossbolts, which unfortunately, they require Trina Lilies, which those items are finite. You can only get a certain amount per playthrough unless you have to farm for them, which the drop rate is just terrible. It is not fun trying to farm for these things. And also another thing with sleep, it just has no identity. The torch scales with faith, the sword scales with intelligence, and the pots scale with arcane. Like, where is it supposed to be tied into? So yes, if the staggered state actually worked better in PvE to where you actually can get a riposte attack off, and if there were like just more sources of sleep, it would be a lot better. But unfortunately, as of right now, it still is one of the weaker options. Number 6, we have Poison. Now, there are two different types of poison, regular poison and deadly poison. I'll get into deadly poison later on. I'll just separate those two. But as for regular poison, yes, it is going to be a damage over time effect that does last 90 seconds. And the damage is flat 7 damage per second and an additional 0.07% damage per second, which it does end up totaling to roughly about 6.5% damage, which doing 6% damage over 90 seconds is not that good. In this game, you could do so much damage with so many different types of things that poison effect is going to be hardly noticeable at all. But the good things about poison is the sources of it. You can get things like the Poisonous Mist Ash of War or the Poison Mist spell, and those things are incredibly cheap, low FP, they have a faster animation, you can use them very easily, and they will actually end up proccing poison very consistently. So you can just use them at the beginning of the fight. It takes like a second. You can proc poison and you can just switch back to your other things. And actually does have some very good synergy with things like the Mushroom Crown and the Kindred of Rot Exaltation Talisman, which both of those items actually do give you additional damage 20 seconds after proccing poison at a closer distance, which unfortunately you have to wait 90 seconds again just to re-proc it. so you can't really maximize your damage with regular poison unless you're using the poison Mothflight Ash of War, which that Ash of War is just not that good in terms of total overall damage, ease of use, stance damage. There are just plenty of other things in the game that can just be much more powerful, that can perform a lot better. And that type of playstyle with having the buffs constantly active with the Kindred Rot Exaltation and the Mushroom Crown is much more beneficial when you have Deadly Poison instead. So yes, it can be useful because it is easy to proc, but the benefits are not that great. Number 5, Madness. Now, when enemies are procced with this status effect, they lose 15% health and they lose 10% FP. And also, they get staggered for a few seconds, which obviously that sound of the effect is just ridiculous, but unfortunately, once again, it doesn't really work in PvE whatsoever, but it is going to be the best PvP status effect because doing that much damage and having enemies get staggered for that long basically just results in instant death in almost every single instance. And on top of that, the sources of which actually do Madness effect are actually really good. Spells like Unendurable Frenzy or Flame of Frenzy can actually proc it really fast, and weapons like the Vike's War Spear or the Fingerprint Shield can just be incredibly obnoxious in PvP. But yes, it sucks in PvE because nothing can actually be procced with Madness at all outside of NPCs, which I feel like this actually should have worked in PvE. I don't know why it didn't. Like, I understand not wanting to design like animations for every single enemy that can get staggered with Madness, but at least deal the same 15% damage that the status effect works against regular NPCs. That would have been cool. And also, if it did do that flat 15% damage in PvE, it wouldn't be broken because there's no real way to actually improve the Frenzy build-up unless you're using the spells with the Dragon Communion Seal. Now, yes, the Frenzied Flame sources are actually all really good in PvE. I mean, specifically the spells, things like the Vike's War Spear and the Fingerprint Shield are probably not going to be as good as damaging options in PvE. That don't really perform that well. But the spells are all really nice. But just specifically talking about the Madness status effect itself, there is no use for it in PvE. Number 4, Scarlet Rot. Now this is another damage over time status effect that does last 90 seconds, just like Poison, but this one is just a much more beefed up version because it actually does do 15% damage over 90 seconds compared to the Poison like 4.5%, and there actually is like a more beefed up version of Scarlet Rot, of which when you actually use the spells, Rotten Breath, XX Decay, or Scarlet Aeonia, it actually does do 33% damage over 90 seconds, which is absolutely ridiculous. It's really powerful. Now, the dragon spells don't really do it as quickly as they used to, so they're not going to really be as reliable, but Scarlet Aeonia does it extremely quickly, and just using that at the beginning of the fight just to proc Scarlet Rot could just make any boss fight just a lot more easy to manage, because there are very few enemies in this game that actually are immune to Scarlet Rot. Now, just like Poison, this actually does work alongside things like Kindred Rot Exaltation and the Mushroom Crown, and that when you proc this status effect, you just end up getting more damage for 20 seconds. Now, the Scarlet Rot's lasting 90 seconds. Unfortunately, that means that you can't really just keep the buffs active all the time against a boss, because you have to wait for that 90 seconds to finish before you can re-proc it again. But I think the biggest downside to Scarlet Rot is that it actually doesn't get boosted by any stat, because with Poison, it actually has great synergy with the Arcane stat. It has a whole ass infusion, and it gives you an Arcane scaling. You improve that Arcane damage, you put points into Arcane, and it ends up just increasing the Poison build-up. With Scarlet Rot, it doesn't do that at all. And with a lot of the weapons in the game that do Scarlet Rot, they all tend to have about 50 or 60 Rot buildup, which in a game where a lot of the bosses tend to have like 400 to 500 resist to this type of status effect, it takes a while to actually proc Scarlet Rot in this game. Now, you actually can do them more consistently with things like the Rot Pots and maybe Rot Arrows and Rot Grease, but unfortunately those things require the Aeonian Butterflies, which they're finite items. You can only find a limited amount per playthrough, unless once again you're doing a bunch of farming, which is definitely not fun to do, because like the drop rate is incredibly low. But proccing Scarlet Rot in any facet of the game against any different types of enemy is going to be extremely beneficial. Number 3, we have Deadly Poison. Now, yes, this is actually different to regular Poison, and the game doesn't really differentiate the two. They still put it under the exact same icon, they still call it Poison, it's still the exact same bar. But some sources will do Deadly Poison, and other sources will just do regular Poison, of which the ones that do Deadly Poison are things like the Venomous Fang, Serpent Bone Blade, the Coil Shield, and Fetid Pots. Now, the main reason as to why I separated the two is because the playstyles between Deadly Poison and regular Poison can be a lot different. Now, Deadly Poison actually is twice as effective as regular Poison, but Deadly Poison only lasts 30 seconds compared to regular Poison lasting 90 seconds, which the Deadly Poison will probably end up resulting in about 4.5% damage, which if you extend that time to 90 seconds like the other types of status effects like Poison and Rot, it'll end up being about 13% damage, which is a lot higher than the 6% that Deadly Poison gets, but it's still going to be lower than the 15% that regular Scarlet Rot gets. But the reason why I like this one more is because Poison actually does scale off Arcane, so going into more Arcane means that the build-up is going to be a lot quicker, which unfortunately the only weapon that actually does do this will be the Venomous Fang. Is the only one of these that actually can be infused, and going with like an Occult infusion and having high Arcane means you can actually proc Poison incredibly quickly and end up doing it twice as fast as like Scarlet Rot could. And being that it only lasts 30 seconds, you can actually maintain the buffs of things like Kindred Rot Exaltation and Mushroom Crown a lot more, because those buffs only last 20 seconds, so basically as soon as the Poison actually wears off, you can just proc it again and just constantly keep having that 30% more damage up for almost half the fight. Now, I'd still rather have the beefed up version of Scarlet Rot, like in things like Scarlet because they do 30% damage, but I didn't separate those because I didn't really feel much of a need to do it, even though I did separate Deadly Poison, so like this ranking is already out of whack. But honestly, you guys are the only ones that really care about the rankings. I don't really put much thought and effort into how I rank them. I just want to talk about these things. So what I'm saying is what actually has merit. So don't really like look at the rankings, just listen to what I'm saying. That's more important. Fuck the rankings. Now, number 2, we're going to have Bleed, and number 1, we're going to go with Frostbite. I'm going to talk about these back to back. I don't really normally do this, but we're going to do it for this one. So starting off with Bleed, this status effect does 15% flat damage, and for Frostbite, this does 10% flat damage, and it actually does debuff enemies to make them take 20% more damage for 30 seconds. Now, the way I actually categorize this is at point blank range, Bleed is better to have, and at a distance, Frost is better to have. And the reason why I say that is because at point blank range, you can benefit of things like the White Mask and a lot of Blood Exaltation, which those things would just result in like 30% more damage for 30 seconds every single time that you proc Bleed. And you'd have to wait for a cooldown for Bleed at all. You can just proc it this next time, and you can just keep constantly having a bunch of amazing damage. But if you're using Bleed at a distance with certain types of spells, or if you're fighting some like really tall enemies to where like those buffs will just not work at all, then Frost is probably going to be the more useful option. But the main separator for me, and that makes Frostbite just more useful, is that it's way easier to proc and it's way more reliable to proc, to the point where you can use Frostbite on any type of build. Even a Bleed build, you can just use Frost, because Frostbite doesn't scale with anything. So typically, a lot of the Frostbite things just have higher levels of Frost build up to where you can just proc them really fast. And the best one at doing this would be just the Chilling Mist Ash of War. You can put the Chilling Mist Ash of War on a fucking dagger. You just lead off the fight with that, and you can just like instantly proc Frost on a boss. It'll be like 10% more damage, and they'll get debuffed on top of that. And that doesn't require any stat investments, not much FP, not much skill, doesn't take much time as well. Whereas for Bleed, if you're going to proc Bleed, you're going to have to spec into a lot of Arcane, or use some Bleed type weapons with Blood Flame Blade that could also do it really nicely. But to really maximize the Bleed damage, a build with higher Arcane would actually do it. But if you don't have a build that utilizes those things at all, then you're not going to really be proccing Bleed that much. Whereas for Frost, it's incredibly easy. Now, one thing I also want to talk about is that when people use the Frost resetting builds alongside Fire, never do this under any circumstance. I don't know who thought of that. That's like the stupidest idea and concept of a build I've ever heard of in my entire life. The best thing about Frost is the debuff, the fact that you can just make them take 20% more damage for 30 seconds. So just wanting to remove that to proc it again doesn't really make much sense, because obviously proccing status effects the second and third time takes a long time to do it. And if you want that type of build, just use Bleed. It just works way better. I would only make an excuse for those type of builds if you ended up having like an Exaltation Talisman or like a helmet to which actually boosted our damage every single time that we procced Frost. That'd be like the only time in which you can actually make a build like that. But being that we don't have those things in the base game, that type of playstyle is useless. But if you were to get into like the sources of Bleed and Frost, all the weapons are really amazing. Bleed probably has us more options and more better options. Things like Mogwin, Sacred Spear, Scavenger's Curve Sword, Cross Naginata, Bloody Hellas. There's a bunch of really good stuff. Whereas for Frost, you still get things like Darkwind, Greatsword, Death's Poker, and Zamor Ice Storm, but there's not really much outside of those things. But Frost also gets the much better spells, because the Bleed-based spells are just not that good in comparison. But yes, they're both amazing. Status effects in general are just really good in this game, especially compared to the other Souls games. Anyway, that is the list. If you have any opinions, just let me know down in the comments below. And as always, please do like and subscribe, because I do have some more videos coming along the way. Anyway, see you guys in the next one. Bye.